Hello and welcome. This video is going to cover Chapter 4 of the JavaScript book, How to Work with JavaScript Objects, Functions, and Events. So let's get started. So regarding JavaScript, there's three different categories of objects. There's what's called host objects, and those objects are part of the browser environment. There's the what's called the native objects, also called built-in objects, and them are part of the JavaScript specifications. And then there's also called user objects, and user objects are what a developer would create themselves. So the first type is the host objects. So you have window. The window is basically your browser window. It's you look at it as a container for everything that's within your browser. Okay. Next is the document, and this represents your HTML document, and it allows you to work with the document object model, which is called the DOM. There's also two other ones as well for host objects, and these are just some of them. This is not all of them, but these are the most common ones. Also, there's a navigator, which contains information about the browser, and there's also a history object that contains the URLs the user has visited in the browser. Now, some of the JavaScript native objects, which are also called built-in objects. So basically, the term object itself is the base object that all JavaScript objects inherit from, and it has a small set of properties and methods, and these properties and methods are inherited by all the other objects that in the JavaScript. Also, there is an array, which is an object that stores collections of data. There's date object that stores a date. Function is a object that stores a defined collection of JavaScript statements. The next three in the list, we have a number, string, and Boolean. And these are all called wrapper objects. And they're basically wrapper objects around the primitive types. As you recall, there's 7 different primitive types, being number, string, Boolean. There's also a symbol, big int, and null and undefined. Now, null and undefined do not have a wrapper objects, because they're basically empty sets, so that they don't contain any wrapper object for those. The three most popular ones here are listed, and that's number, string, and Boolean, with probably number and string being the most popular. And also there is a math object, which is a utility object, has all types of different methods that can be used for mathematical functions. So here's a primitive number for pi, and so you've got a variable pi that's equal to 3.14159, right? And so this is a primitive number. So there's different functions that you can, or different methods that are part of the number object that you can use on your number. And here's like one where you're doing a toFixed. So this is basically you're going to round this number to 2 decimal places using the toFixed. Now, what happens in this case is, since pi here is a primitive, when this code's executed, the JavaScript engine would use a wrapper object, because a primitive doesn't have any methods. So the JavaScript engine determines that you're trying to use a method on this, and it will use the number wrapper object to be able to make that conversion. So here's just kind of a quick review of the terms. So, I wanted to point out that an object has both properties and methods. And a property is something that kind of defines or says something about your object. So let's say, you create a string, call it hello world. Well, there's different properties you can use that are part of the string wrapper, right? The string object. And let's just say one of them is length, and length is just a property. It tells you something about your string, your hello world string. It tells you the length of that string, right? So that's called a property. And a method is an action word, either an action or some kind of a transformative type operation, such as we looked at the number, we do to fixed on a number. Also, like with strings, you can do to uppercase, to lowercase. You're doing a transformation. You're taking some kind of action, and them are the methods. So objects are made up of both, have both properties and methods associated with them. I think we've kind of covered these other ones here on the list. So one of the methods of the window object, there's multiple ones. One of them is a confirm. And here's an example of a confirm. So a case where you would probably use this is, maybe there's something on your screen where you've got a delete button, you can delete something. You click the delete button, a confirm would pop up, and it would ask you, are you sure you want to delete this item? And there'd either be, it'd be either you okay or you would cancel. If you click the okay, it's going to return a true. If you hit cancel, it's going to return false. So basically, in this case, you're checking if confirm delete. So if it's true, then go ahead and, you would go ahead and delete the item. If it was false, you would not delete the item. And I'll show you an example of this. And here's a screenshot of one here, but I'll show you in the code as well. One thing I did want to kind of mention here is also for this confirm, you're generally going to have this as part of inside of a function. If you just have this right here within your code defined without being inside a function, it's just when you load your code, it's automatically going to execute this right away. So that pop-up would happen right away in your code. So really the only way to control that is, you'd have it within a function, and that function would be executed based on probably clicking like a delete button or something that would call that function. Then that code would be executed to create that confirm. So here's two methods of the window object, parse int and parse float. So basically with parse int, you're taking either a string, you're going to take either a string or maybe a number that has a floating point, and you're going to convert that into an integer. So a lot of your using like methods like prompt, when you prompt a user for information and they put in a bunch of numbers, let's just say, what is your salary? You put in the numbers. When you submit that, that's actually, at that point, it's a string. So that needs to be converted into an integer. And you would use a parse int on something like that. Also, as well, like in this example, it's showing you a floating point. So it's basically going to truncate. It's going to truncate all of this, the .6789. Parse float. parse floats, basically the same thing here. But you're in this case, you've got a string and you're wanting to convert this into a float. So here's three popular methods of the document object. And you have query select all, and write. So query select, when you're using this one, this is something where you want to make sure that there's only one available, right? So usually you're using maybe an ID, which an ID should be unique on your page of your HTML element needs to have a distinct ID, and you could use query selector on that, or you use query selector all, and you could use that on something like a class that you have defined and where you have multiple of those. And there's other options as well for that. And basically, this write is a write, and this actually writes to your HTML file. I mean, to the HTML. I shouldn't say to the file, but it writes to the memory that's allocated for your HTML document, right? So if you do a document.write, it's going to show on the screen. Obviously, if you reload your page, that's not there anymore because it would be flushed from memory at that point. So like we were just saying about the query selector. So in this case, you have an HTML element and whose ID is rate, and you use the pound for an ID, and so this would just return the rate, and this wouldn't necessarily return the value that you have there. This is going to actually return that whole input field that you have. It's going to actually return that whole HTML element, and we'll see it here in a couple, in the next couple slides, where you actually would add at the end of this dot value, and it will return the value of that field as opposed to the whole HTML element. Here's another example where you are using query selector all. In this case, it's returning all A elements that you have. And so this links is going to be basically an array of all the different A tags. So this is going to have links is going to have multiple. It's going to have an array of objects of HTML elements of type A. And here, you're basically doing the same thing as the A elements. You're just using all the ones that have the class of .err, and that would also be an array of objects. So whenever you do query select all, you're always returning an array. And if you just use query selector by itself, you return just one individual HTML element. Here, it shows that you can actually, you could use kind of descendant tags, so you can return all of, in this case, all of frequently asked questions, all the H2s for each ID of FAQs, right? Here is a combination of selectors where you're returning all divs that have a class of closed. And in this case, you're returning an array of elements, that either have an H2 tag or have a descendant div p tag. Now this, here's an example of a document.write. And so you're just writing this right here to the page, and obviously, like I just mentioned a few minutes ago, you're actually creating. This is just created in memory, right? This is just created on your HTML document in memory. And then obviously, if you refreshed your page, this would be gone, and that's the way that works. Here's a couple methods of the text box object. Very popular ones is, focus to put focus, and also select, and that's to select it. Here's a couple property values. Value is the value of that text box object or disabled. We've looked at toFixed already. So in this case, we've got a couple input types of text with one with an ID of first name with a sales amount. So in this example, it's showing you how to get the input element of first name based on the ID. And you're assigning that to this variable first name, and then you're kind of reassigning first name to be the value the value of that HTML element. This is one way to do it. This is without chaining, or you could just go ahead and do it like this, where you have your first name variable and use chaining by adding this dot value. So it will just return the value of this HTML element that has the ID first name. And this is kind of showing how to use like chaining with something like a parse float. Obviously, you're setting this variable sales amount using the ID of the HTML element that has sales amount, and obviously that's going to return the whole HTML element. And then you're taking and reassigning sales amount to the value of that. And then you're going ahead and assigning it again you're parsing that to a float. And the other way to do this is use chaining, where you're actually using the parse float, and within your open and close parentheses of that, you're doing your query selector, getting the sales amount, and doing the dot value all on that, all in one line there, right? One statement. And here's a couple other examples as well. One thing to really watch here is when you would do something like parse float, you need to parse float on the value, and then after you get the value. So at the end where you close the parenthesis, then you would do the toFixed at the end of that. You don't want to do toFixed within this open and close parentheses. You actually want to make sure you do the toFixed after you get the value back. So after the end of the parentheses there. So here's a syntax for creating a new object. You basically have the variable name and you create the new object. The important thing is the open and close parentheses. This kind of shows just by looking at this, you can tell you're using an object because you got the open and close parentheses here. This is the date object, which comes, this is one of the built-in native objects of JavaScript. So here's some examples of some of the different methods of the date object. So you can take a date object and turn it into a string. You can just get the full year. You can get the date, or you can get the month. Here it's showing just some, here's a property of the string object called length, right? And like we were discussing earlier, the properties just giving you some information about that object. In this case, you're saying, what is the length of this string object? Whereas methods are more of action type words. It's doing an action. It's maybe transforming something. And here you've got, these are the most popular ones here. You're doing like index of, so you're actually trying to find what is your position of something within your string. Substring is another one, and basically here you're just taking a piece of your string and you're just basically starting at a certain spot and you're grabbing for a certain length, and you're just grabbing that part of your string. Same thing pretty much here with substring. Then you got two lowercase and two uppercase. You're just turning into lowercase, uppercase. This is just an open and closed parentheses on these. It's a very popular method used on strings. Let's see what else we have here. Upper length. Okay. So we're just kind of a little bit of a review here, I guess. So, we have a global object, which is basically your Windows object. You have your document object. That's basically your HTML document, right? You have text box. You have a number object. We talked about method chaining, date object. We've seen our date object. We looked at a string object, and we'll look at it. I don't think it talked about a constructor here. We'll look at constructors later. This is a basic function declaration. And so this function name, this is what you would, this is user generated, whatever name that you would give the function. This is called a function declaration, and this is kind of the more what I would call traditional function. This is how everyone used to do it. People still do it. It's just that, there's other options nowadays with like arrow functions that are much more prevalent nowadays. So here's a function declaration with that you would name that you're naming show year, open and close parentheses, means there's no parameters, nothing to pass in. You're just creating a date and you're doing an alert here. And this is when you want to call this, you would just do it like this, show year. That's how you call that function. This is a function declaration with one parameter. And so in this case, don't let this dollar sign kind of confuse you here. This dollar sign, you can name, a dollar sign is one of those identifier, one of those, you can name a function, a variable, a dollar sign. In this case, you're actually naming your function dollar sign, and you're passing in a selector to it. So here you're basically passing in the selector, doing a document query selector on that selector, and you're just doing a return of that. And this is how you would call that. Basically, the name of your function is this dollar sign. You're passing in your selector, And then after this is going to return, this is going to call this and return your selector, and then you're getting the value of that selector and putting it into here. Here's a function declaration with two parameters, doing both a subtotal and a tax rate. You're doing a mathematical operation on the two parameters that you passed in, subtotal times tax rate. And then you're just returning that tax, and you're doing a to fixed on that. And to call that, you basically would call that by doing calculate tax, passing in your two parameters, right? And you're doing alert. So actually, probably correct way to say this is these are your parameters are the ones that are in the function. These are called parameters. This is what you're passing, right? And so be called arguments. So these are the arguments. Now you also have what's called function expressions. We already looked at function declarations. These are function expressions. And here you write it a little differently. You do a function and then your parameters. And you're basically setting this to a variable. And open and closed. Curly braces with a semicolon at the end. So here's an example where you're doing this functional expression called show year, just like we did before with the other one with the declaration, but you're actually, the variable is show year, and that is assigned to this whole function here. And this is how you call it. So somewhat similar. Here's one. So here you're doing, kind of similar to what we did on the declarations, just written a little differently, where you're actually setting it using a variable here. And so your variable that you gave it was a $sign. And so you're passing in the selector to this function. And this is going to return your query selector, and you're getting the value and putting that in your email. And just like we did on the declarations, pretty much the same thing here. You're just calculate tax as your variable, and you're calling it the same way down here. Now, arrow functions have become much more popular in recent years. And for a small function, for something small, simple, you don't probably save a lot. But if actually there's cases where you can actually write a arrow function that can be a lot shorter than doing a declaration or an expression. So here's the syntax for arrow function right here. As you notice, you've got this equal sign, greater sign for the arrow function. So here you don't have to have that function code, or you just assign this variable. These are the parameters that are passed in. And then here's the statements that get executed. So here, you're rewriting this as an arrow function, this function expression, rewriting this as an arrow function. And in this case, you're not really saving anything as far as making, simplicity. I guess you're not using the word function here, But in some cases you'll see that you can actually really save a lot of extra coding to create an arrow function. It's much more efficient and easier to read and understand once you get used to it. So here, as you can see, you're setting your calculate tax equal. This is your parameter. You just have to get used to being a little bit different. You don't have the parameters in the parentheses like you did for the declarations or expressions. It's done a little differently, right? So there's just one parameter subtotal, and then basically you're pretty much doing the same thing as we did in the declaration and then expressions. Yeah, here's one. Here's an example of one with no parameters. So I guess just as a quick review, we've seen how we call a function, and actually it's all three types of functions. Basically you're calling them pretty much in the same way there. The name of the function, and then open and close parentheses, and depending on if you have anything to pass it, and the things you're passing are called arguments when you're calling it. The function itself has when the things that are being passed in are when you create the function, you're actually are called parameters in the function, right? And so we talked about function declaration, how that looks, parameters, argument, we're passing in parameters. So a function can either sometimes it might return something, sometimes it just takes some action and that's it. So whenever you've got the return word in your function, then you're actually returning some value from that. We've talked about hoisted in the past, the function expression, arrow function. Okay, I think we covered most of those. So this is just kind of talking about global variables. In most cases, you really don't want to use the var keyword anymore. It's kind of outdated. There's really no reason unless you have something you want to have a global variable throughout. There's still other ways to do that as well. But most of the time, you just use a let or a const for your variable declarations. So this example here, we're showing how the var keyword has a different scope than the let keyword. The var keyword has a function scope. So basically here they have a little loop, and once you complete this loop, you still have visibility to that I variable that you created there, and so this would print out. Whereas here it's showing that let actually has a block scope, so you only can access that J variable here within this scope here. Anywhere in here. So let me just anywhere in there you have access to this J variable. But once you're outside of that, once you're outside that block, you don't have access to it, and you'll have a reference error. So the important thing to remember, let has a block scope. VARs have a function scope. And also VAR, if you define a VAR at the, say, the top of your, anywhere within your file, if it's outside of a function, if it's outside of a block and you just define a VAR, that's going to have a global scope. Here's some common elements, common events, I'm sorry. So for window, you have a load event. For the document, you have a document object model loaded event. Buttons have on click a click event, which is called on click. Also, controller link has a focus, blur. Control event has change or select. Elements have a click, double click, mouse over, mouse in, and mouse out. These are just ones you can play with, and you'll learn as we go through this course of the different ones that are available to the different objects. So here we're going to talk about event listeners and event handlers. And so this is the basic syntax for an event listener. You have your target, you add your event listener, you have an event name and the event handler function. So what you would do here is you create an event handler. So in this case, you're using an arrow function and you have this, so that you're creating this JavaScript function called join list. And this is just a little alert. So here's the function you created. And then what you do is you attach the event handler to the click event. And you do this by here is your event target. Your event target is a submit button. And then you're adding your event listener. And so basically you're saying on click, run join list. And it will run this function. And basically this is very similar, doing the same thing. Here's your event target. You're adding your event listener. In this case, you're doing a double click, and you're calling joint list when you do a double click. Here we're handling a DOM content loaded event. And so in this case, basically document add event listener. We're using the DOM content loaded, and then we are executing the show message, which is this function. That's showing, and this is going to, this add listener will invoke this function once the whole content has been loaded. Your document object model, all that HTML has been loaded in the browser. When that happens, the show message will be executed. Here's an example of the same thing, except instead of using a function here, it's doing what's called an anonymous function. And the purpose of using an anonymous function is when a lot of times if you're just wanting to do something one time, it's not like you're wanting to reuse some function multiple times and be called from different places. And in this case, this is just called once you load the page, this function, and you're actually embedding this function as an anonymous function right here. And this will go ahead and execute this once the add event listener is triggered because the DOM content has been loaded. So let's go ahead and I think we spent enough time on this PowerPoint presentation. Let's go ahead and look at some of the code. So we're going to go ahead and talk about some of the concepts in chapter 4. And also, while we're doing that, we're going to review some things as well. So right here, we've got a couple strings. And this one is str, and this is str2, and they're set to the same thing, hello world. And these are primitive strings, correct? And these are called string literals. This is called a string literal. And so whenever you would, if you use a property or a method, a string property or method on this primitive, what this JavaScript engine will do, it will automatically wrap the string primitive in a string object so you can access this property, or if you're using a method, that as well. And so in this case, we're doing length, which is 13. Over here on the right-hand side, you can see in the console, the length is 13. And like a quick review on this. So, objects, we're using, like I said, we're using that string wrapper object here. And objects have both properties and methods. And so in this case, we're using a property. And a property is usually something that a property is going to describe something, tell you something about that object. And in this case, we're finding out the length of this object, and also there's methods as well, and methods are more of an action word. So for like a string object, you have a 2 uppercase, 2 lowercase, things like that. And so that's actually doing like a action. It's transforming that to an uppercase or lowercase. So it's more of an action type word. Okay. And I just want you. So this right here on line 19, this is a different way to create a string, and this is using the string object to do this. Okay. And there's a reason I have these. I'm doubling these for both the primitive and for the object, because I want to show you that how they are same or different. And so if we go here and do the string, let's do is string equal to string 2. So if we hit enter here, it's going to say true. So it's saying that this is equal to this, and that's correct, right? Line 9 is equal to 10. But this ends up being different in the case of a object. So in this case, we're going to do this. And this is false. And that's because you're basically creating a new object, and then when you create new objects, the one object is unique from the other object. Even though it has the same value of hello world, in memory, it actually is in a different spot in memory, and it's actually a distinct object. So, that's something that, you need to be careful about. If you ever see some code or that has creating new objects like this, you have to be careful when creating objects that because how they are stored in memory, and even though the values may be the same, they will not be equal to each other. In most cases, you really don't want to create a string like this. You really want to use the primitive and use you can use the string literal. Okay, and this is just showing here that you've got that string itself is a string, and the second one, the string object, is an object as we expect. Okay. Also wanted to kind of look at this a little bit. So here, let's put this back to a 1. And this is going to be, I think, number 1 here. So right here, this is going to be, because it's defined like this is a number, right? Type of test. We change this to a 2 here. And the second one is going to be a string. And that's what we expect. But one thing, and this is kind of a little bit of a review here. So when you take this and we compare these to each other, that will be false if you use the triple one. If you use just the double equal sign, when you use the double equal sign, that is using it's using that concept of coercion, where it's actually converting that, saying, hey, you're wanting to compare these two, and it will convert them so they're the same type, so it can compare them. So just remember that the double equal sign will use the coercion. When you have the triple equal sign, that will not use the coercion. So in this case, they're false, and in this case, they're true. Let's go up here. I'm going to take a look at this real quick. So this is a confirm statement. And here, what this will do is, I have this just at the top of this file. And obviously, you really don't want to do this in most cases. This is something most of the time you're going to have this confirm statement in some kind of a function. Because when you have it in a file like this, basically, when you load your file into the browser, it's going to automatically execute this confirm, and it's actually executing right now. And the reason you don't see it on the right hand side here is because the console's kind of detached from the page. Let me move the page over here. So here's the page. It's basically saying, are you sure you want to delete this item? If you hit OK, it's going to return true. If you hit cancel, it's going to return false. So let me go ahead and hit OK here. And as you see at the top here, it returned true. If I refresh this again, and this time I'm going to go ahead and hit cancel. Let's go look at the top of the console here. This time it returned false. Okay. So, that's logic. It's actually very good a very good concept to use for when you do have some situations where you're asking the user if they want to delete something. They click the delete button, and then you say, are you sure you want to delete this? And that's a good tool to use. So let's go ahead. And like I said, you really don't want this at the top of your file. You really want to put this, in some function. So let's save that. Here, let's go ahead and we're going to look at this. This is a query selector, right? And so taking a look at our page real quick, we don't have a lot of HTML on our page, but we do have a couple things here. So we have some fields here. Let's make this large for a second. We have some fields here, and we have some placeholder images, 3 placeholder images and some fields. All right, let's go look at we'll go look at our code in the editor as well on that. So here we've got some text inputs, email address, rate, amount, username. We have a button called ship button, and we have 3 placeholder for images. Okay, so here we're getting the email address, and then in this case we're doing a selector on that. And so here's the element for that. I'm not sure why I did this. Like that. So let's just let's fix this here. Oh, sorry, wrong thing here. All right. So this is number 2 above, and you can see type of it's an object, and this is basic. It's an HTML element object. So if you went ahead and did the email address dot value here, save that, and it would be returning actually a string. Okay. I'll look at parse int here. So basically, by using the parse int, You're taking this floating number, which has two decimal places, and basically it's just going to truncate this, meaning it's just going to remove that, and your answer is going to be 461. And that's on the right hand side. You can see 461 over there. And yeah, here we can skip on here to number 5 here. So here's a parse float. So we have this number with 5 different decimal places, and we're going to go ahead and do a 2 fixed on this. And this is that same thing we're talking about here. So this user cost, this is a number, right? This is a number. We're using the primitive here, and since we are calling here, we're calling a method on that primitive, and when we call a method on that primitive, it will use the number wrapper object, so we can use the 2 fixed method, right? So here, this is number 5 here, and on number 5, it's going to go ahead and round this. When it uses the 2 fixed, it's going to round it. And so you got 949. 9 is greater. So anything 5 and greater, it's going to round it up. If it's less than that, it's going to round it down, right? So here it rounded to 95. We change this to a 4 and save it. As you can see, it went ahead and rounded it down to 94. Here is number 4. Here is an example using the date object. And in this case, we've created a date, May the 9th of 2000. And it's displaying Monday there, right here. And then also one thing I do want to make sure that we to realize here is that the month actually is an array, and with arrays it's always 0 based. So for 12 months it's going to be start at 0, and the 0 is January, and 11th the 11th one is going to be December. So it's 0 through 11 is January through December. Something you always want to keep in mind. So whenever you do a get month, you're always going to probably want to add a 1 to that to make sure that you get the correct month. Okay, we already looked at that. So this is just using a query selector. We kind of looked at that already. Number 8 here. So number 8 here, what we're doing here is we're getting all the images, query selector all, and this is actually going to be an array here. And then what we're doing is getting the alt, because we have an alt defined on each image. And by doing 0, because it's an array, we start at 0. That's going to be the first one, right? So for our 3 images, it's going to be 0, 1, and 2. So we change this 0 to a 1. And we save this. Over here on the right hand side, you will see that the alt says image 2 down here. And then if we did a 2, you will see that it is image 3. So this is what you get if you try to do one. So this doesn't exist, and it will throw an exception. You're trying to read an attribute. You're trying to read this attribute on something that doesn't exist, and you're going to get an error on that. So this is the amount field, and we have a 200 in here. And so if you see over here, we're doing, we're using the query selector on the ID amount, and we're doing a value on that. And that is value of 200. So, and basically that's the same as Another way to do this is called chaining. And so we can actually do it like this as well. And as you can see, the amount is here. We're using the chaining up here, and we just, so the amount will be right here, and then we're just going to display it. So it's basically the same way of doing it, just a different, basically you're going to get the same result, just a different way of doing it. And that's called chaining. Here we're doing a query selector on this rate, and we're actually doing a focus. This is also called chaining. But what we're doing is we're not getting an amount. We're just saying we want focus to this field. So if we go ahead and look at that page here real quick, let me bring that up again. As you can see, when you bring this up, you're focusing on that field. So here we have the name Donnie Duck, and we go ahead and we're doing a substring on that. And we're starting at position 0, which is the very first position. And we are doing this for 5, for the length of 5. So we do count the 0 index position. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it'll, from 0 to 5 will be Donnie here. And as we see on the right-hand side, that's what we have. So our amount field, we have a 200 in it. It's editable, right? We can edit this. But if we go ahead and change this here, so what we're going to do is take that field that we defined up here earlier. We defined this a field called amount element. Amount element is the HTML element. And we set this attribute disabled to true. So if we save this, and so here we have the amount field disabled. Can't put anything else in there. So we're talking about functions earlier. We have different kinds of ways to define a function. We have function declarations. We have function expressions. We also have arrow functions. So here's an example of a function declaration. We use the keyword function, the name of our function, open and close parentheses. Oh, didn't mean to do that. And then in this case, we do have a return value on this one. We're returning this as the function declaration. And that's number 16. Here you go. This is a function declaration. We're returning that. So here we have a function called getUser age. We're passing in a user, and based on that, which is in this case an object, and then we're getting the age, which is a property of that user. And if you look down here, we are passing in age of 25. So basically, this is the user object, age is 25. It's getting the age, and the age is 25. Here's basically the same function as above here, as an arrow function. And in this case, we've got a user object, and the user object has an age. And it will print out the same thing. Here's another example of an arrow function. Where you just got one parameter called message. So you can pass in message, display error, passing in, here's your parameter you're passing in. Or I should say this is an argument. This is an argument that gets passed in into this function, and this function has a parameter message, and we'll print out that message. Just here's an example of a a function that we defined as add, and it takes in two parameters, an x and a y. And you're just returning, this one's going to return x plus y. And this is how we call that, using two arguments, one argument of 5 and the other argument of 3. And we'll display an 8. Here's another example where we've got, we're sending in two parameters, item cost and num items. We set that to a variable for get cost. So this will be the function name that we're going to be calling. And we're going to send in two variables, two parameters. And here are the two arguments that are getting passed in. And this is going to have a return total. So this here will return that total, and we will do that total. We'll do a to fixed of two decimal places. And that is 4.3 here, and so that will be, your cost is $79.50, including a tax of 07. Here's a event listener, a couple different event listeners. I'm really just going to go ahead and look at the second one here. And this one here will it's doing a mouse over based on the username. So let's go ahead and look at our HTML. Here we go, look at our HTML over here. So we have this username. And we just have a placeholder here for username. But this is the field. This is the ID username, right? So here we're at an event listener and we're doing a mouse over. So when that mouse over takes place, it's going to send a console log every time. So right now you can see it says hi once, probably because I at one point I'm sure I moused over it. So if you go ahead and look over here, so you got this username right here above this image. And if I go ahead and just mouse over this, you'll look on this right-hand side. It always says hi once, but you'll see how that changes. Now it's 2 times. Every time I mouse over, it's incrementing it. So over and over again. So that's using the event handler and using a mouse over function. And I think we also have a, where's ship it at, I think. Oh, yeah. So, yeah, well, we'll go ahead and look at this. So we have, we're adding an event listener, which is the DOM content loaded. And then we're actually adding embedding another event listener for the ship button. And so when you go ahead and click that event, it's going to go ahead and tell you it's been clicked. And so if we look over here at the console, when I click ship it, you can see that ship it button has been clicked. Okay. And then obviously, every time you do it, it's just multiple times. It's right into the console log. So that's about all I have for chapter 4. And next up will be chapter 5. And I think that's going to be more on using the console and debugging. So a lot of the console stuff we've already done. Learned about the console, but we'll learn how to set breakpoints and stuff like that to do a little more advanced debugging in the console. And that will be for chapter 5. So thank you very much and have a great day.